where a tiny mistake cost 9 officers their lives in a grizzly attack. In today's video, we're examining 5 devastating encounters where law enforcement officers faced nature's most lethal predators, from a tiger's silent ambush in India to a mountain lion's calculated strike in California. But first we begin in Alaska, where a tiny mistake cost 9 officers their lives in a grizzly attack. It was February 12, 2025, in Katmai National Park, Alaska. The day began with heavy cloud cover, temperatures barely above zero, and a steady fall of snow. The wilderness training drill had been scheduled months earlier, but the weather and the terrain made it clear that the margin for error was razor thin. Sergeant Daniel Price, 44, was the senior officer leading the training detachment. He had been with the Anchorage Police Department for 2 decades, known as a steady but hard-edged supervisor. Most of his career had been spent on urban patrol, with only limited exposure to backcountry work. Price had volunteered for this cold-weather survival course, partly to prove his unit could handle wilderness assignments, without leaning on park rangers. Among the 10 others were patrolmen and junior officers, men and women used to traffic stops and domestic calls, not the raw unpredictability of Alaskan terrain. Their motivation was mixed: career advancement, departmental pressure, and the simple expectation that orders were followed. The group had flown in 2 days earlier, outfitted with snowshoes, rifles, radios, and limited winter gear provided by the department. Since few had prior survival experience, a ranger briefing that morning emphasized the risks of thin ice, deep snow, and wildlife, especially grizzlies. The ranger had specifically warned them to avoid an old salmon stream that still held carcasses under ice, where bears were occasionally active even in midwinter. Several officers laughed, remarking that February meant hibernation season, and pushed the warning aside. Price let it stand, unwilling to delay the day's training exercise. Grizzly bears in Katmai typically weigh between 700 and 1,200 pounds. While many enter dens during winter, not all follow predictable patterns. Older males, especially those who find lingering food sources, may remain semi-active and den shallowly. A bear startled from its den in deep snow is highly defensive, and its speed, up to 35 miles per hour over short bursts, can overwhelm even armed groups. The landscape around Katmai was unforgiving. White spruce and alder thickets crowded along narrow creeks, with heavy drifts concealing holes and ice patches. Visibility dropped as flurries thickened, and the officers' formation stretched unevenly. Radios crackled as they tried to stay in line, but muffled echoes in the snow-covered forest made it hard to gauge direction. By mid-afternoon, the detachment moved into the thicket near the stream the ranger had cautioned against. Snow had drifted over a depression that concealed a den entrance. The only warning came from a faint, musky odor that a few officers noticed but dismissed. What seemed like a trivial oversight carried consequences none of them could reverse. At 3:40 p.m., in an instant, the snow burst apart. An estimated 1,100-pound grizzly erupted from the ground, roaring and charging at the nearest figure. Officer Tyler Green, 29, slipped on ice while trying to raise his rifle. Jim Belanger, one of the survivors, later said that the bear struck Green's head with one forepaw, the blow instantly fatal. Panic set in immediately. Several officers fired, but their shots went wide, cracking branches and shredding bark. Investigation details showed that at least one round struck the bear's flank, but failed to stop its charge. Despite the wound, the animal pressed forward with full force. Sergeant Price shouted for them to hold formation, but his commands were drowned out by the roar and the screams. The bear barreled into Officer Louis Banks, 31, seizing him by the shoulder and dragging him into the brush. His cries carried over the gunfire until they abruptly cut off. Officers closest to him tried to pull him back, but the bear slashed through them, tearing one man's arm nearly off at the elbow and crushing another's torso under its weight. The chaos split the group. 3 officers turned to run, discharging rounds blindly behind them. One slipped into a drift and was overtaken, mauled while the others fled. Another tripped on his snowshoes and was dragged down within sight of his comrades, the bear's jaws closing over his back, shaking him violently before tossing him aside. The snow was churned red across a wide patch of ground, with rifles, packs, and helmets scattered. Though bleeding heavily from earlier hits, the bear's momentum carried it through the scattering formation. formation, striking targets in quick succession before retreat was possible. Sergeant Price attempted to rally the survivors, firing point-blank into the bear's flank. The autopsy suggests that the animal must have turned on him, smashing him against a tree with enough force to break ribs and puncture his lungs. Others tried to pull him free, only to be knocked down themselves. Recordings later confirmed that officers made repeated radio transmissions during the attack, but the steep terrain and poor line of sight caused signals to break up. Only when one officer activated an emergency satellite beacon did rescuers receive a clear alert. Radio transmissions captured during these minutes were garbled and frantic. Bursts of static, shouts for help, overlapping gunfire, and screams. Then silence followed. When rangers and a state trooper unit arrived, they found the bear dead roughly 50 yards from the main cluster of bodies, its trail marked by heavy blood loss from multiple gunshot wounds sustained during the struggle. The ground around the den was torn open, littered with spent casings and shattered gear. 5 officers had died at the scene. 4 others, retrieved alive but catastrophically injured. 3 of them succumbed en route to medical evacuation, while 1 in the hospital. Only the 2 who had managed the radio call survived, Chris Barbeau and Officer Daniel Lee, both requiring multiple surgeries. The aftermath in Anchorage was subdued but heavy. The department held a closed memorial at their precinct headquarters, with flags lowered and an honor guard present. Public statements emphasized the dedication of the officers but avoided details of the incident. The National Park Service review concluded that poor preparation, disregard of explicit wildlife warnings, and inadequate wilderness experience had been central failures. Ultimately, the deaths were cataloged as preventable, a result of human error colliding with the realities of the Alaskan backcountry. However, even as these police officers' training in Alaska ended in the explosive fury of a grizzly, in India, 2 patrolmen stepped from their boat. Unaware a male Bengal tiger lay hidden, ready to drag them into the mud. It was September 8, 2016, in the Sundarbans of West Bengal, India. The tide had begun to fall, leaving slick mud flats exposed between the dense mangroves. By evening, the story of how 2 police officers underestimated the terrain would become part of the Forest Department's records. Inspector Rajesh Chatterjee, 39, had built his career on rural law enforcement, working small-town beats where his reputation was for steadiness and reliability. He was not reckless by nature, but he was firm in his belief that crime, not wildlife, posed the greatest risk to villagers. Poaching had been a problem in the Sundarbans for decades, and his goal was to prove that local patrols could enforce the law without always depending on outside specialists. Chatterjee's habits reflected this pragmatism, methodical note-taking, an insistence on punctuality, and confidence in his ability to impose order in uncertain environments. Constable Arvind Rao, 32, was less experienced but eager to impress. He had transferred from a district where his duties had centered on traffic enforcement and small disputes. His motivation was simple: to follow his superior's lead and show competence under difficult conditions. Neither man had formal wildlife training, but both carried rifles and assumed that was sufficient protection. That setting in Sundarbans had thick mangroves pressed close against tidal channels, their roots rising like tangled walls from the mud. This is home to one of the largest wild populations of Bengal tigers, with adult males weighing between 350 and 420 pounds. Unlike many tiger populations, Sundarbans tigers are known for their tolerance of saline water and their willingness to stalk humans. They are powerful swimmers, capable of moving silently across channels before emerging unexpectedly from cover. Their bite force is sufficient to crush bone instantly, and attacks often occur without warning. Earlier in the week, villagers reported livestock disappearing from pens at night, and fresh paw prints had been seen pressed deep into the mud near fishing nets. A forest guard had advised postponing the patrol until trained trackers could join, but Chatterjee, focused on his assignment, believed the real danger lay in armed poachers. Rao followed his lead, carrying his rifle with casual readiness. Their guide, a fisherman hired to row them through the creeks, urged caution, pointing out claw marks on tree bark near a narrow channel. The officers acknowledged the comment but pressed forward, intent on checking fishing nets for signs of illegal activity. By late morning, the tide had receded enough that the boat grounded in the mud at a shallow bend. The fishermen steadied it while the 2 officers stepped out, their boots sinking into wet silt. They moved slowly toward the nets, rifles slung over their shoulders, scanning the area for human tracks. The fishermen lingered by the boat. Mangrove cover loomed only a few yards away, dense and shadowed. The stillness was complete until it broke all at once. The tiger's charge was almost soundless. From the mangrove wall, the 450-pound male surged forward with explosive speed. In a single bound, it struck Chatterjee from behind, jaws closing on the side of his neck. The fisherman later described how his body crumpled instantly, rifle slipping from his hands into the mud. The tiger dragged him down, blood spreading across the wet ground. Rao reacted with panic. He raised his rifle and fired, the shot grazing the tiger's shoulder. The impact startled the animal but did not stop it. Dropping Chatterjee's limp body, it spun with startling agility. In 2 strides, it was on Rao, knocking him backward into knee-deep mud. His rifle fell aside as the tiger's claws raked down his chest, tearing fabric and skin. The fisherman, only a short distance away, shouted and scrambled back toward the boat. The struggle lasted minutes but felt longer. Rao tried to push the animal back, but the tiger clamped down on his abdomen with its jaws before the predator shook him violently. The mud churned under their bodies, darkening with blood. The officer's movements grew weaker as the tiger held him pinned. When Rao stopped moving, the animal released him briefly, only to seize Chatterjee's body again, dragging it toward the mangrove cover. The fisherman rowed frantically away to call for help. The boatman reached a village downstream and raised the alarm. Forest Department rangers arrived hours later with a retrieval team. In the aftermath, only Rao's body lay on the mud flat, torn and soaked in blood. Chatterjee's remains had been carried into the mangroves, leaving only drag marks and splashes behind. Rao's body was transferred to his family the next morning for cremation under police supervision. Chatterjee's partial remains were recovered days later, identified, and released to family for final rites. Both funerals were brief, attended by relatives and assigned police representatives. Department officials issued standard condolences, and no extended public coverage followed. The matter closed quickly in official records, leaving the families to grieve in private. Yet even as 2 men in India fell to a Bengal tiger's silent charge, in South Africa, a constable leaned into a thick brush, unaware a boom slang above him carried venom that could turn faint puncture wounds into unstoppable bleeding. It was March 17, 2014, in Limpopo Province, South Africa. The midday heat pressed down on farmland near the edge of low scrub. Constable Jacob Mokoena walked the perimeter of a fence line with a local farmer, unaware that the slow hours ahead would turn from routine inspection into a fatal encounter. Jacob was 28, only 3 years into his service. Known among colleagues as diligent, he had a reputation for following orders and working hard on rural patrols. Most of his duties involved theft reports, traffic stops, and assisting on property disputes. The assignment to check fences for signs of poachers was simple, something he considered straightforward police work. Wildlife hazards, while common in the region, seemed less pressing to him than human threats. He carried a sidearm, but no specialized gear, convinced his training and calm approach would be enough. His personal life reflected the same steadiness. Jacob lived with his parents in a modest house in Polokwane, saving money toward his goal of one day transferring into detective work. He was methodical about his routines, jogging most mornings and keeping meticulous notes in his case files. His motivation that day was clear: support the farmer, address the complaints about fences being cut, and complete the patrol efficiently. However, the landscape offered no comfort in this part. Hidden in the thickets above, dangers were not always large or noisy, but quiet and easily overlooked. Boomslangs, though slender and green, are among the most lethal snakes in Africa. Adults can reach 5 to 6 feet in length and are known for their ability to blend seamlessly into foliage. They spend much of their time in trees, striking with sudden speed when disturbed. Their venom is hemotoxic, disrupting clotting and leading to catastrophic internal bleeding. Symptoms may be delayed, often lulling victims into underestimating the seriousness of a bite until collapse sets in. Snakes were common in the area, particularly during hot midday hours when they sought shade in shrubs. By early afternoon, they reached a section of fence where wires sagged and bent low to the ground. The farmer paused, pointing to a tangle of brush at the base of a tree, saying he had noticed something shifting earlier. Jacob stepped closer, crouching to inspect the wire. His forearm brushed near a branch hidden in the foliage. Then the brush itself came alive. The strike was instantaneous. A boom slang, coiled and hanging, lashed forward, its jaws catching his exposed skin. The bite left 2 small puncture marks, barely visible. The farmer shouted in alarm, but Jacob pulled back sharply, the snake retreating into the foliage. He inspected the wound with little concern, dismissing it as minor. For nearly half an hour, he remained steady, only flexing his hand as though testing stiffness. His demeanor reassured the farmer briefly, though unease lingered. However, within the first hour, the signs changed. Blood welled from Jacob's gums when he spoke, and thin streams began to drip from his nose. His skin grew pale under the heat. The farmer urged an immediate return to the truck. The farm was nearly 40 miles from the nearest proper clinic, and the route was little more than a dirt track broken by washouts. Even in a sturdy pickup, the drive could stretch past 2 hours, and with no ambulance available in the district that afternoon, there was no faster option. By the second hour, Jacob doubled over, vomiting dark fluid onto the dirt. His hands shook uncontrollably, and purple blotches spread along his arms. They began the drive to the nearest clinic, the farmer accelerating across the rutted track. The symptoms escalated in real time. Jacob's breathing became ragged, punctuated by spasms as he pressed his hands against his abdomen. He coughed repeatedly, spraying blood that stained his shirt. His eyes appeared unfocused, and his movements turned jerky, uncontrolled. The farmer tried to keep him upright in the passenger seat, but each mile worsened the scene. When they reached the village clinic, Jacob was already unresponsive. Medical staff attempted to resuscitate him, but the damage from systemic bleeding was beyond reversal. His skin showed deep discoloration, and his clothing was saturated with dark fluid. Death was confirmed on arrival. At the clinic, staff notified the provincial police commander, and word spread quickly back to Jacob's station. Instead of a formal service, officers accompanied his body to Polokwane and stood with his parents during the funeral, where he was cremated according to the family's wishes. Neighbors filled the family yard that evening, leaving food and sitting quietly with the family while his father spoke about Jacob's steady character. The farmer who had been with him gave a written statement to authorities, and his account was circulated in training bulletins for rural patrols. Rather than an official press release, the lesson filtered informally through briefings. Hemotoxic snake bites do not wait, and distance to proper care can be the deciding factor. The constable's fence check in Limpopo ended with boomslang venom silently unraveling his blood. And thousands of miles away in Uganda, a sergeant tried to tie his canoe. Unaware, a Nile crocodile waited in the reeds, ready to explode from the water. It was July 3rd, 2017, on the shores of Lake Kyoga in central Uganda. The lake stretched quiet and flat in the dimming light, papyrus reeds shifting in the wind, concealing what lay beneath. And hours later, the silence would be shattered by a brutal accident witnessed at close range. Sergeant Peter Okello was 36 years old, a career police officer assigned to rural patrols. Born and raised in Sorati, he had grown up fishing on small dugout canoes and wading in these waters since boyhood. Colleagues described him as dependable and pragmatic, not reckless, though he occasionally downplayed threats he believed he understood. The patrol work was routine: respond to theft complaints, calm disputes among fishing families, and maintain a presence where formal law rarely reached. He carried himself with quiet authority, comfortable in settings that unsettled others. The July patrols had added strain. Villagers reported stolen nets and gear near outlying islands, and police were stretched thin. For Okello, the assignment meant steady pay and proximity to his home village. He valued these dusk patrols, considering them straightforward, and his habit of standing in the canoe to better scan shorelines had never brought consequence before. The decision would seem minor at the time, even practical, yet it placed him in direct reach of the danger hidden in the reeds. The papyrus along the lake edge rose nearly 10 feet high, thick and concealing. Lake Kyoga supports one of the largest Nile crocodile populations in Uganda. Adult males can exceed 16 feet in length and weigh over 1,000 pounds. Their bite force is among the most powerful of any animal, capable of crushing bone in a single snap. They wait motionless at reed edges, using explosive bursts of speed to ambush prey. Warnings had circulated in the weeks before. Several villagers swore a massive crocodile had been spotted near the papyrus channels, one describing it as longer than the canoe itself. Fishermen urged patrols to stay clear of shallow reed banks at sunset, but the men were under orders to check these same shorelines for evidence of theft. That night, when the canoe drifted against a tangle of reeds, Okello rose and stepped to secure the line, treating it as routine maintenance. His partners remained seated, focusing on their radios. The first sign was the sudden movement of water at the base of the reeds, a shift too abrupt to be wind. Before Okello could react, a massive crocodile lunged from the shallows. Its jaws clamped around his right leg with a violent snap, jerking him from the canoe in a single motion. He screamed as the animal dragged him into the water, clawing at papyrus roots that tore loose in his hands. His colleagues saw his body twist unnaturally as the crocodile's tail whipped against the canoe, rocking it sharply. The water erupted in thrashing. The men swung their paddles at the animal, but the blows had no effect. Okello's voice carried over the chaos, high and ragged, before it was cut off as the crocodile rolled. His body was yanked under in a cloud of mud, bubbles breaking the surface. The surface went quiet. The officers kept their paddles raised, waiting for movement they could not track. Seconds later, the crocodile broke through again, jaws locked higher on Okello's torso. The sight was brief but searing. His arms flailed once, then the animal submerged, pulling him into deeper water. The men shouted in shock, trying to keep the canoe steady as waves from the struggle lapped against its sides. The reeds shook violently, then fell still. The two survivors sat stunned, the canoe drifting off balance. They called for help on the radio, their voices unsteady, but response was slow. With limited coverage in the area, the call reached a district station nearly 20 miles away, and rescuers arrived more than an hour later by motorboat. By then, there was no trace of Okello, but streaks of disturbed water and lingering ripples spreading through the reeds. Over the next 2 days, searches of the shoreline yielded fragments of his torn uniform and a single boot lodged in the reeds. No remains were recovered intact, consistent with crocodile predation in the region. The reports filed by his colleagues provided the only full account of the attack, their words steady but shaken, describing the suddenness and force that overwhelmed them. Local authorities reported the crocodile to the wildlife authorities, which classified it as a direct threat to human life and authorized removal, though no confirmation of its capture followed. After the incident, fishing activity around that section of Lake Kyoga nearly stopped. Families refused to let children go near the shallows, and some households moved their nets to deeper, less productive waters rather than risk the reed banks. Even men who had fished the lake for decades admitted they no longer trusted the silence along the papyrus edges. The fear spread quickly, carried in evening conversations, and warnings shouted across the shoreline, turning a familiar lake into something that felt hostile and unpredictable. Patrols resumed, but villagers treated the water with a new wariness, avoiding places where Okello had disappeared. Even as Uganda's waters claimed a protector undone by the crocodile beneath, thousands of miles away in Mendocino's hills, a lone deputy would learn that the forest shadows hid a hunter older than badges and uniforms. It was November 6, 2013, in Mendocino County, California. The backroads west of Ukiah were quiet at dusk, the woods stretching dark and uneven, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath a patrol truck. The assignment seemed simple, but the silence carried unease. Before night was over, a routine check would end in violence no one on the force had expected. Deputy Stephen Cole was 31, a steady officer with 5 years in the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office. Colleagues described him as quiet, more comfortable in the field than in the station. Born and raised in Ukiah, he knew the backcountry roads better than most. Cole volunteered often for rural patrols, valuing the solitude and the sense of direct service to the scattered communities that lived outside the main towns. He had no record of rashness, but he carried a belief that familiarity with the terrain offered protection in itself. That belief shaped his choices that evening. Residents near a wooded trail had reported possible illegal hunting camps, and Cole took the call without hesitation. The assignment aligned with his reputation as reliable and willing to cover difficult ground. Little did he know, although sightings are rare, mountain lions are native to Mendocino's forest. Adult males can weigh over 130 pounds, with muscular bodies built for short bursts of speed and ambush attacks. Their bite force is strong enough to puncture the thick hide of deer, their primary prey. They rely on stealth, often stalking silently for minutes before lunging from behind. Attacks on humans are uncommon, but typically occur in dense brush at dawn or dusk, when visibility is poor. poor. He radioed his partner to advise of the report before proceeding alone. He parked his patrol vehicle along the dirt track as the light faded, carrying only his sidearm and a small pack. It was not unusual for him to check reports alone before calling for backup. For Cole, the decision felt efficient and practical, not reckless. 40 minutes later, his partner arrived to assist, finding Cole's vehicle empty on the roadside. Following footprints into the brush, he recalled hearing a muffled gunshot ahead, followed by silence. The sound was faint, enough to cause concern, but not enough to pinpoint location. He pressed deeper into the woods, guided by the broken path of disturbed undergrowth. The faint shot and trampled brush gave him only fragments, enough to confirm that Cole had run into trouble. What happened in those moments was pieced together from evidence and his partner's later account. Cole seemed to have entered a small clearing when the lion struck. From behind, the animal lunged, claws raking into his back as it knocked him forward. The force drove him face first into the ground. His sidearm jolted loose as he hit. The lion's jaws locked into his neck and shoulder, shaking violently. Cole managed to fire a single shot into the dirt, but it did little to break the attack. The struggle left clear marks. Blood spattered across low branches, and deep drag lines cut through the leaves where the lion pulled him several yards toward thicker brush. Cole's uniform was torn through at the collar, the fabric darkened and shredded where the animal's teeth had torn flesh. His attempt to push himself upright ended quickly as the lion drove him back down, weight pressed across his torso, claws sinking in with each movement. By the time his partner broke through to the clearing, the scene was in full motion. He saw Cole on the ground, pinned, the lion's body hunched low as it tore at his throat. The deputy fired his own weapon without hesitation. 2 shots struck the lion, which released Cole and collapsed nearby. Cole lay motionless, blood soaking the earth beneath him. His throat was torn open, the wound catastrophic. His partner attempted to find a pulse, but it was already too late. The attack had lasted less than a minute, but the damage was irreversible. Officers later confirmed the lion was a 3-year-old male in poor condition, underweight and aggressive, consistent with being forced out of its territory. Reports noted the evidence of predatory intent, stalking, ambush, and immediate targeting of the neck. Cole's body was recovered that night, and the area was closed briefly to residents. The aftermath left a mark on those who lived near the trail. Residents reported hearing the echo of gunfire and later avoided the woods entirely. Hunters who once walked the back roads freely began moving in groups, keeping radios on as they checked their camps. For weeks, no one passed the clearing where Cole had fallen, though nothing visible remained but darkened soil and broken branches. His partner returned to duty, but colleagues noticed he never volunteered again for patrols west of Ukiah. Thanks for watching. If you liked these stories of firearms becoming useless in the face of apex predators, click here for more.